You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabon.
Greetings and welcome to the Contemplative Light podcast. I'm your host, Clint Sabon. Contemplative Light provides education and resources in a global effort towards inner transformation through meditation and contemplative prayer. You can find us on Facebook as Contemplative Light, where we've got a very active Facebook community, or at our website at contemplativelight.org. And there are different ways to support the show and keep our lights on, so to speak. You can write a review on whatever podcast app you use, like iTunes, Apple Podcast, wherever it is. I think most of them have reviews, and writing one will definitely help us appear higher in the rankings. You could also go to our website at contemplativelight.org, make a donation, read and share our articles, take one of our online classes, which for a limited time we're offering for free due to the COVID-19 pandemic. You could also buy the new book from our executive director, Mark Thomas Shaw, Dante's Road. And Dante's Road has just won an Illumination Book Award. So congratulations, Mark. Big event for us. And my guest today is Chris Luard. He's a frequent guest of the show, and he is in Thailand as we speak. And so we have kind of hemisphere to hemisphere quarantine show here. And I really like Chris, mainly just for his sincerity and authenticity as a person and as a meditation teacher, and just something real refreshing about him. You know, when I first started doing Contemplative Light, it quickly became apparent there was something called the business side of spirituality. Spirituality becomes a business. And I've called myself wondering at times if a real enlightened person would even mess with such a thing. A lot of hassle, a lot of promotional stuff, a lot of schmoozing, all sorts of things. And it seemed at times like people I met in my life before the days of Contemplative Light, if they weren't really the more authentic spiritual seekers, the random bohemians, the girl at the coffee shop reading a book about Buddhism, the people who meditate just because they do it, have no interest to make themselves known to the world, kind of like the way Eckhart Tolle lived before his book took off. And Chris kind of reminds me of that kind of person, even though he does work full time as a meditation instructor at various places. He kind of seems a little too zen to ever become a big guru, but better not speak too soon because lightning can strike anywhere, anytime, right? So in the beginning here, we just talk about what's been going on. We catch up on air. We did this thing where we said we would not catch up before we went on air, so we didn't write messages back and forth catching up. We was like, nope, save it for on air, and we logged on and nope, sorry, pressing the record. We're doing even our initial catching up basically on air. So you get to kind of listen into a conversation of two friends catching up in the beginning. But, as we get into it, we go into some meditation and non-duality and have a lot of interesting topics in this podcast, actually. And he makes some good book recommendations too. So I'm going to put those along with other links in the show notes below. Enjoy. Yeah, Chris. Hey, how's it going?
I'm fine, Clint. How are you doing today?
Doing good. So, you were saying you were in Thailand and you were quarantining for a while, and now you're at a center where you teach meditation. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, we're doing a quarantine. Well, sort of a quarantine up here at the center as well. But it's quite easy to do that because right now the center is closed. So there's only 7 of us on about 6 acres of land. So it's quite easy to stay isolated. And it's a beautiful farm up here, organic farm, lots of fresh papaya and pineapple and oregano and basil, all really, really great stuff to eat. So I feel pretty lucky actually to be here in this pretty beautiful setting in the northern Thailand, right in the mountains close to Myanmar. It's quite beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. That does sound very lucky. So what were they just like, look, we're not open, we're closed down, but why don't you just come and help keep the place going while while we wait for this to pass?
Something like that, yeah. Actually, we are doing work. We're in meetings a couple of times a week. We're kind of reconstructing the program, more or less. Not really from the ground up, but I don't know, doing some patchwork, I guess, trying to make the program even better than it was before, enriching the program with lots of ideas, and yeah, kind of. I'm actually creating a retreat program for the center, which was hopefully going to start in May, but actually, obviously, that won't happen now. But now we have some more time because the place will be closed to really put some thought into how we want to execute the retreats and how we want to move forward. So we're actually using the time rather constructively while we're closed to make improvements. So it's actually quite an inspiring time, a creative time to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then just before that, you were quarantining in Chiang Mai?
I was in Chiang Mai for about a week. I had gone to Myanmar on a trip because they didn't have any cases of coronavirus in Myanmar, and many people up here consider Myanmar another, like a suburb of Thailand, if you will. And so a lot of travel happens quite freely between Myanmar and Thailand. So I went up to Myanmar, went and saw some amazing temples in Yangon and Old Bagan. Um, and so that was lovely. But then that trip got cut short by about 3 days because they were starting to close Thailand down. And I just made one of the last flights back from Myanmar. It was about 12 hours before they shut the country down from any flights in or out. And so I just made it under the gate. I was lucky for
Wow.
that. Yeah.
Wow.
And then ended up spending a week
Yes.
in a small apartment in Chiang Mai. And then got the invite to come here, and I gratefully accepted the invite to come back up to the center here.
Cool. So how is Thailand right now? I guess it's April 6th. I haven't looked at the numbers today. What's Thailand doing as far as the virus stuff goes?
Well, luckily, yesterday we saw a decrease in cases and fatalities. So, but you're right; it is a day-to-day experience. We are on a partial lockdown. There's a curfew from 10 at night to I think 4 or 5 in the morning. So nobody's allowed out at that time, and they're arresting people and fining people if they are out. Most of the restaurants, cafes, bars are closed for the most part. Most restaurants are doing takeout only. So if they are open, they're only serving takeout. So a lot of precautions are in place. They are forecasting a complete lockdown starting on Friday, but not sure if that's going to happen yet or not. But generally, what I've noticed in Thailand is that if they forecast something a few days ahead of time, uh, they're going to go ahead and do it. It's kind of a warning, that's what's coming. So be prepared, kind of thing. So I imagine we'll be on full lockdown for most of April and into the first week of May, probably.
But it seems like over there in Asia and some of those countries that y'all are kind of taking the quarantining and lockdown stuff and social distancing maybe a little more seriously than we kind of did in Europe and America and stuff. I mean, I know that we've kind of gotten on board for the most part in America, but I mean, obviously this is kind of new for everybody. So there's even people now still saying that maybe it's not that big of a deal and should we really be doing all this? Believe it or not, there's still people in America saying that, but
Yeah,
probably in Asia, everybody's probably on board because you're more used to pandemics.
yeah. I don't think in Asia there's any doubt that this is a real, very serious issue, a very threatening a lot of people's lives. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It doesn't seem to be the widespread belief of that this is some sort of conspiracy theory, or I don't hear any of that over here. I see some of it on social media, but yes, I think most of that is coming from the States. Um, and it's an interesting thing because I'm not sure if it is a conspiracy theory. I'm not sure who would benefit. Who would who would have come up with it? You know, where is the benefit of this for anyone? I think it. I'm of the mind that this is hurting everyone, and so it doesn't. I'm hard pressed to find out who would be the culprit of creating such a conspiracy, because I don't see any benefit. I don't see any winner in this situation. I think we're all struggling together. I think we all struggle and feel that stress in different ways, but I don't think there's anybody right now in the world who's not feeling some sort of stress, emotional, physical pain, or suffering from this pandemic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I haven't seen a whole lot of, I mean, I saw conspiracy stuff at first. I think that seems to have died down, but I think there's probably just people thinking maybe it's not as big of a deal, you know. I mean,
Mm,
there's going to be dissenters. I mean, it's kind of been an eye opener for me in that it's very hard to change people's way of life and what they're used to and their routine and to really get their attention. I think it was very frustrating because I started following this in late January, early February, and I saw it coming. And I heard the WHO, I heard the scientists, I heard everybody saying, it's coming. Countries need to wake up. This is serious. And no one was on board here, and I
mm,
would tell that to people and they would almost kind of get annoyed with me and, what are you worrying about? And I wasn't necessarily worried. It was more like it's like trying to get people to wake up and pay attention. And it was just like banging your head against the wall. But then, bit by bit, it got everybody's attention finally. But
yeah,
it took a while. And it kind of just made me realize how self absorbed folks'
mm,
lives are, and also kind of there does seem to be a thing where like if you don't see it, you don't quite believe it, or it doesn't quite hit home. I think some people seem to be able to see things on the news or read articles
mm,
and see what's happening and it really hits home. But then others, I guess if they don't see it in their immediate surroundings day to day, maybe it doesn't hit home as much. It's interesting.
yes,
It
yeah.
just kind of goes to show how firmly ingrained habits and patterns and conditioning really can be.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the last thing I think people want to do or expect to have to do is to stay home for for an extended period of time, or to give up their freedoms, but particularly in America and Europe too. I think uh, there's such an emphasis in our culture on being free. That to have to surrender that to an invisible force such as a virus, it's inconceivable, I think, to many people, particularly young people, early 20s, where they feel invincible anyway at that age, and so to have to surrender your spring break trip, or to have to surrender your college partying, or whatever it is that you have to give up. Uh, I think it's like I said, an inconceivable concept until your grandparents get sick, or until your neighbor's parents get sick, or even your own friends get sick. And I think that's when we start to experience it personally, the repercussions personally. I think that's when it really starts to come home. I was on a
Yeah. So
I was going to say
go ahead.
I was on a cruise ship teaching Buddhism and meditation, and that cruise
Great
ship.
place to be for coronavirus.
Well, that's just it. I mean, we were one of the first ships that felt the pressure from it, and we ended up having to close shop. The ship pulled into dry dock. They got everyone off the ship. Luckily, and I feel very, very lucky that they made that decision when they did. That was February 14th, Valentine's Day, when they evacuated everyone. And so I kind of, in a way, consider myself lucky that I was able to first be healthy when I experienced the first repercussions of it. And um, that allowed me to see how serious it can be, and how serious things might get. I was on a ship at the same time that the first ship went and got really sick in Japan. We were disembarking when that was all going down. So in a very real way, it was very, very. It affected my life in a very real way, in a very tangible way, early on. And so for me, I think it drove it home. So when they announced social distancing, when they announced the isolation policies and things like that, I was like, all right, I'm going to take it very, very seriously, because I already had seen it, and so it kind of made me more cautious, I think, than the average person.
Sure, sure. And what do you notice in other people, maybe on the cruise ship or in Myanmar or in Chiang Mai? How do you notice them?
Yeah, it's been interesting. In Myanmar, because they had no cases there when I was there, everything was pretty relaxed. It was almost like the virus didn't exist. It's
Wow.
they've just opened their borders to tourism the past 4 or 5 years, and so they, much like Thailand, actually, they really, really count on the tourist dollar. It's fundamental for the way of life that's budding there. So I think there was a lot of downplaying of the virus up until the last minute. Um, Good, hats off to Myanmar. They closed the border as soon as things started to get serious in Thailand. They shut everything down. There wasn't even a case there when they started shutting things down. So I was happy to see that they had started taking it very seriously just as I was leaving. At the same time, they were still in the hotels. You had to sanitize every time you came in and out of the doors. They took your temperature every time you went in and out of the hotel. Not just the hotels, but the shopping mall. Anytime you went in and out of pretty much anywhere, they took your temperature, they gave you hand sanitizer and things like that. So there were some precautions in place, but no social distancing. Not many people were wearing masks and things like that.
What about your family in America? Have you talked to them?
I have talked to them. Yeah, they're taking it very seriously, which I'm grateful for. My sister and my niece and nephew, they're doing homeschooling now. Of course, all the schools are closed in Georgia, and it seems like they're taking all the necessary precautions, wearing the masks, not going out unless it's necessary, and so I'm happy to hear that they are doing everything that's necessary to stay safe. Yeah.
And then you were with your girlfriend, right? And you quarantined with her in Chiang Mai for a little while before
Yeah,
coming to the center.
yeah, and she's here with me now too. We actually have a little kitten as well.
Oh, that's sweet. She got to
Yeah,
come with you to the center. That's awesome.
yeah. It's really good that we can be together through this, and yeah, it makes a huge difference in the quality of my life, for sure. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, and how are things in Texas?
Well, that they haven't issued a stay-at-home order statewide, but most of the major cities have something like that or akin to that, and we have for a while.
Hmm.
So I think that non-essential businesses have been shut down for a couple weeks, I think, at this point. Obviously, some businesses tried to stretch it for a while, and then I think they got in trouble.
Mm.
Uh, Definitely stories of businesses trying to say they were essential, but maybe they weren't really essential. And, I think people bit by bit are taking it seriously and social distancing, and it generally seems to have caught on that people are taking it seriously. But there are people out there, I think, that it's not like they're on a conspiracy trip, that they just, I don't know, that maybe they're just tired of the disruption, or they don't like it, and maybe they don't think it's that big of a deal, or maybe they just hear a low death rate and they think, this is kind of a big fuss about something. I don't know if it should be this big a fuss. There are people like that around.
Mm.
I wouldn't say they're the majority of people by any means, but there are people like that I've heard some. But as far as me, I mean, I've been quarantining hardcore. I just decided to go all in. I think I needed solitude. I think I needed to quarantine in general, just, for my well-being and way of life. I think I was kind of longing for it. So the minute I heard about the virus, even before there was any sort of city order or state order, I was like, I'm just staying at home. I'm not leaving the apartment. And I have my food delivered, and I have everything. I just get it all delivered,
Yeah.
and I basically, where I'm living is very nice, and there's a place to walk, and a little trail, and I kind of do my exercises there. And it's kind of almost been an excuse to be a hermit, because I think before all this happened, I would have felt a little bit guilty, or like, am I isolating? I need to go out more. Okay, I need to hang out with people more. I need to do this more. But this just kind of made the decision for me. Okay, you want to take a little hermit solitary retreat? Go for it.
Yeah.
You've got the social consciousness on your side on this one. That's what you're supposed to do. So there's been a coinciding, I think, of those things happening. But
Hmm.
for the most part, so far so good. I've enjoyed it very much, and doing my prayers and meditations. I still have work and grad school stuff going on too, but I can do that from home. And then
Mm.
I've spent more time with contemplative light stuff, and even taken some clients for coaching. I've logged into, one of the psychic networks that I've worked for on and off, and given psychic readings
Mm.
online or on video on an app, and that's been fun, and makes some money too. And
Mm.
so, yeah, and discovering new podcasts. So yeah, I mean, it's not been a day at the beach. I mean, obviously this is a pandemic, and it's got its fair share of alarm and anxiety. And I see the headlines here, and you
Mm.
know I think most organizations are scrambling, and people I know are kind of scrambling and having a hard time adjusting to everything. And
Mhm.
places are flying by the seat of their pants to kind of keep things going in a virtual way. And they kind of lose their temper and snap, and that
Mm.
happens. So I mean, it's a huge event, the biggest of our lifetime, as far as I can tell, by far. So obviously all of that is going on, but again, so far so good.
Mhm.
I'm lucky and blessed and grateful, and hopefully God will keep the blessings coming.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a great outlook, and I think you're right. We are lucky, those of us who have a meditation practice, or have a practice of prayer, who have a those, or artists, musicians, and things like that. Those people who are drawn to solitude are definitely benefiting in this pandemic, for sure. And yeah, just to have the reason now to be alone, to stay at home, to do the meditation practices, to read, to write, to create music, things like that. It's for that, it's been quite wonderful, absolutely. And it's good. It's good to be able to take the pluses and to capitalize on them, in any situation, regardless of what that situation is, to be able to see the benefits, the silver lining, and to try to rest in that silver lining rather than, driving the negatives all the time. Particularly now, I think we need the positives. Really need the positives to be pronounced. So I think it's really good. Mm.
Yeah. So if you want to switch gears, I'd love to just throw some random meditation spiritual questions at you
Sure.
if you're up for it.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
I wanted to ask you because to me, it seems like in the meditative process of everything, there's a kind of dropping back into being, or dropping almost kind of behind the physical realm in a way of everything going on. And I know that some meditation teachers will just talk about quieting the mind over time, but I mean, to me, it seems like there's some sort of dropping back into the formless that's almost essential. And when you have that, that's kind of when your mind can turn off, when you can find an off switch, as Eckhart Tolle calls it. Is rather than just, I guess it's almost like sometimes I feel, the other is almost just a way to get to that. The meditation practices or whatever techniques, or even something like a mantra, would be just a way to get you to where you can kind of just be, find your own inner groove to drop back into the formless. So I was wondering what you have to say about all that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think meditation, in many ways, most meditation techniques, or if not all, uh, um, uh, can bring one to that formless, or in touch with that formless space. Um, Definitely one of the great benefits of meditation practice is to be able to rest in that formlessness. Um, and then the thinking process still unfolds, but we see the thoughts more as a form. We see the thought form, so we don't take our thoughts so seriously. The thoughts are there, but we don't need to follow them. And so when that starts happening, the thoughts do seem to become less dense, if you will. There's less of the rapid fire succession of thoughts. The thoughts seem to come when they're needed rather than just out of habit, which is quite a relief, because that then the gap that's in between the thoughts, or the space, the formlessness underneath the thoughts, becomes the abode, if you will. It becomes where we normally rest, and the thoughts then, when we need to do our taxes, or when we need to write a book, or write poetry, or when we need to create something, or when we need to cook, then we need the thinking mind as the tool, which leads us to the kitchen and cracks the eggs and things like that. But then when we're at rest, the mind can also be at rest in that formless space. Generally, before meditation, or even it can continue on for quite some time, for meditators, or people with a spiritual practice, a mantra, for example, or centering prayer. Thoughts will continue to be habitual for quite some time. But eventually, generally eventually, some people do fall into it suddenly, rather immediately. You mentioned Eckhart Tolle. I think he's one of those fortunate souls that managed to drop into the formless without practice, so to speak. But for most people, A practice can bring somebody into that formless so that the thoughts are seen just as much as form is the furniture. Or I like the example of the bird song. So when we're sitting, right? If you're sitting, rather just could be sitting in your car, in your apartment, or in meditation, it doesn't matter. You hear a bird song, you don't identify with that bird song, right? You just hear the beautiful sound of the birds. But for some reason, we identify with our thoughts. The thoughts are in our mind, and we think that's who we are. We are that train of thought. But with a meditation practice, we slowly begin to separate from that identification. We drop that identification till the point of eventually where the thoughts become kind of equal to the bird song. Both are forms that are passing through our awareness. We don't take the bird song seriously, and so we don't have to take our thoughts seriously as well. Or like the clouds in the sky, or any other form that you see in front of you, you hear in the aural field, any sort of thought form, sound form, visual form. It's all a realm of the form. The meditation practice or the spiritual practice, the mantra practice, the centering prayer allows us to disidentify with all sorts of forms, so that we can rest in that formless like that. So yes.
Yeah, that's one of the favorite things that you've said. One of my favorite things you've ever said. I think you might have said it even on another podcast we did, but it was just your thoughts aren't that important, because I think that's such an easy trap to just start, you start thinking about things and you think, wow, I've got to resolve this, I've got to settle this, I've got to work this out in my mind, rather than just saying all those thoughts are not that important. That's actually the problem, that I'm thinking that all those thoughts are important. None of those thoughts are important. None of that even matters. And to just get to that space and undercut the entire thing, it's so powerful, and it's so easy to, forget about and get lost in it.
Well, I think that's the common state of most of humanity. We are hypnotized by the thought forms in the mind. The idea that the mind has at all times a backdrop of empty space, I don't think people really get that. That there is always this backdrop of silence underneath the thoughts. Just in the same way that in the aural field, in the sense of hearing, there's always a backdrop of silence underneath the sounds. The mind is very similar to that there's always this field of silence there. But it's just that generally, and my mind was very much this way before I started meditating, that the mind is just rapid fire thought all of the time, because that's just the habit of the mind. And it's funny, because when we start a meditation practice, or when we start trying to break the habit of thinking, the mind will play all sorts of tricks to try to keep thinking. Because the last thing the mind wants to do is to shut up. Because when the mind starts to find that silent space, it's scary. For many people, this sense of fear arises, because the mind, the ego doesn't exist in that silent space. So in a way,
Well, it's like I think it's like you think your thoughts are somehow helping you stay safe, So it's like when you're silent, the thoughts aren't there. It's almost like the mind is thinking so much and keeping the thoughts going, because it's like it's almost this evolutionary thing for survival, or for our betterment. Like we need, I say we, like meaning like me, but like there's different parts of me, but it's just kind of like we need to keep thinking, because that's what's gonna keep us safe, or that's gonna get what we want. That's what's gonna help us get what we want. That's what's going to, meet this objective. So we've got to just keep thinking.
Yes, and I think there are
Yeah.
studies done by evolutionary scientists that have now shown that that's the thought process did evolve as a part of the fight or flight response. So that's and for I think hundreds of thousands of years, it was necessary to keep thinking because there was so much danger in our environment. We needed the thinking mind, just like we need the thinking mind to go cook the eggs for breakfast. But 10,000 years ago, we needed the thinking mind to keep us away from the lions or to keep the cave warm when it was snowing, and there was much more danger and much more real, visceral experience that we needed the thinking mind, the logical mind, to work our way through. That has come to an end many, 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 many hundreds of years ago, but that those habits are still in place. And
But
so,
what changed hundreds of years ago? Like what exactly changed? Like how come we wouldn't need the thinking mind now to do our jobs and get by day to day in the same way that ancient
Mhm.
people did?
Well, I think we do need the thinking mind to do work and things like that. But I think now we're in a place in our evolutionary growth that the thinking mind can now be optional. That we don't need to be thinking 24 hours a day, and then even when we fall asleep, we're still thinking through our dreams and things like that. All of that is exhausting, and I think probably, well, a great portion of the thoughts that we have really nothing to do with what's happening in the present moment. Uh, I think a great percentage of the thoughts we have are about things that happened many years ago or days ago or months ago, or about anticipating what might be happening tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, whatever. And so when we can really be in the present moment and experiencing what's arising right now, we don't really need that much thought to do that. And so there's a great energy reserve there when we can drop the thinking mind or allow our presence to embrace the present moment. We don't need to expend so much energy on defense the way we might have in the caveman era and so forth, where we were constantly having to think about where the lions were or where we were going to get our next meal, the hunter gatherer mode, and the modes of safety where we needed to be able to survive. And so, in a way, uh, I think, no pun intended, I think the thinking mind uh, was kind of an evolutionary step to keep the human species alive, much in the same way that an apple seed has cyanide in it. So that it makes it indigestible for animals to eat, so that it comes out the animal after they defecate. And so apples are now abundant in nature because animals can't digest apple seeds. And so, in very similar way, the human species evolved this complex mode of thought to keep us safe, to allow the human species to 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 exist, to continue. But I think all of that is
Sure.
unnecessary now, and I think that in the same way, if we were to just uh, somehow be able to drop into the present moment and see on just to experience the silence there, we start to see as humans we don't need that defense mechanism anymore. We don't need to enter into each situation with this field of logic, this screen of thought that we thought we needed to work our way through each situation. It's so much energy that we use in that logic in the thinking mind, which could be used in many, many other more beneficial ways.
Yeah, and just to realize we have the option to turn it
Mm.
off when we need to.
Yeah.
We have the option to go in and out of it. It's just like, you get caught up in overkill. You're doing something fairly simple, but your thoughts are acting like there's a giant lion chasing you. Then you can catch yourself and just be like, wait, none of these, all this thinking, this is just kind of not necessary. Let's just step out of this for a sec.
Mhm. Oh, and it's such a relief. Yeah, it's such, that silent space that I was referring to, that's in the present moment, that's always there in the mind. That's the birthplace of creativity. That's the spark of creativity, is to be able to rest in that silent space. That's where, uh, well, as one teacher likes to say, that's the birthplace of the universe. The birthplace of stars come out of that silent space. And so to be able to tap into that, there's so much energy, so much raw energy and creative energy in that silent space, that is, as you say, I think you said, beyond the thinking process or underneath the thinking process. That silent space, there's so much beauty, creativity, such force and energy, that and I think it's a matter of trust. I think it is just letting go. We don't need to be thinking right now, and just to use it as kind of an experiment. Well, what would it feel like if I didn't think for the next 5 minutes? What would that feel like? You know, and to see, just to sit and to see. Well, what are they talking about? What are all the spiritualists talking about? The meditation masters talking about? What Let me see what that feels like, just for 2 minutes to sit. And I think if people do that, well, first they start to see how difficult it might be. And so, but then once it really starts to happen for people, it's like, oh, wow, it's like breathing fresh air when you've been locked in a city for all your life, and you finally go out to the mountains and you're like, oh, wow, this is what air feels like. And so when that first gap, or that first space in between the thoughts, starts to reveal itself, it's one of the biggest reliefs, I think, that people can have access to. It's like, oh, wow, right, I don't have to be thinking all the time. I don't have to live my life with this train of thought that's replete with stress or anxiety or fear or aggression or anger. All of that, I that's all optional. And so when people really start to drop into that space in between the thoughts, there's just such beauty there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm almost thinking of people putting a post-it note too, just to
Mm,
remember, like a big post-it note on the refrigerator, or like a dry erase board somewhere. I have a dry erase board, that's why I'm thinking of that. But if you don't,
mm,
I guess you could put it on the refrigerator or on the wall or anywhere, but you could just put like, none of these thoughts are that important.
yeah.
And then like every time throughout the day, throughout the quarantine, you just look at the thing, oh yeah, because you're probably going to be caught up in your thoughts, like whenever you look at the note,
Mhm.
so every time you look at the note, it's just like, oh yeah, none of these are that important. And then it just, because I think it's like an inertia thing, like the more you do it, the easier it gets to do, like almost a muscle.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why meditation, or centering prayer, or contemplation, or mantra, that's why it is a practice, and yes, and it is, at least for me, it has been very gradual. And I think for most people it is. It's kind of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back thing, and it is a slow opening into that silent space, or that recognition that the thoughts are just like the songs of the birds. We don't need to identify with that anymore. And you're right. Any sort of technique where you can remind yourself of that periodically throughout the day. I have some people who I work with one on one who set an alarm on their phone, a meditation bell that just goes off periodically throughout the day. And when they hear it, they just take a few conscious breaths, as a way of stepping back into the present moment, of letting the thoughts go. And so having a practice like that is a great accessory to a meditation practice, or to any practice where we are releasing the habit of thinking.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you is about free will, because I've heard different Eastern teachers uh, put it different ways. I think kind of both concepts are helpful, but one concept is the concept of non-doership, where you basically have all these variables came together and you didn't really choose the genes you had. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose the history of human evolution that happened before you were born. You didn't choose how the earth was. And so all these variables came together and you had nothing to do with it. And then you're born, and the same thing just basically continues, where everything in the circumstance is constantly conditioning you, who you didn't choose, and a circumstance you didn't choose. So you basically just have, yourself and the circumstance mingling like a chemical reaction, and none of it was ever chosen, and it was all out of your control, and every action that you ever do has been out of your control, because of that. So in that sense, it's predetermined, and it's just a bunch of variables that you could plug in at the beginning of time and run the program and set it off, and everything's only going to go one way. So that's the side of, there is no true free will and everything is predetermined. And then on the other side, I've heard teachers talk about how you're actually choosing everything, and you're even choosing the parents you were born to because of karma you needed to work through in this lifetime. Perhaps you came out of another lifetime, you still had some lessons to learn. You chose some parents to help you, have those lessons, so you'd be born in a certain place and maybe go through a certain kind of experience. And then even all the experiences that happen to you throughout your life are in some way, just a manifestation of choices you're making moment to moment. So it's actually kind of all your creation in a sense. You're basically creating your own destiny, and you've created your own journey throughout lifetimes, and we're just going to continue to just create our own trip here. So those are the two sides, both very, very cool, and can open you up and help in different ways. I was wondering, like, where you find yourself in that mix of concepts or spiritual teachings.
Yeah, I think both are, you're right, both can be quite helpful in different ways. I do find myself kind of right in the middle, I think, of both of those. The idea that I don't really think I buy into the idea of that we choose our parents. Although I've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I've studied it quite extensively. Done a lot of the practicing that's outlined in that particular text. So even in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it claims that one would have to be really quite accomplished to be able to choose your rebirth. And one of the reasons that Tibetans take meditation practice in general so seriously is because they believe that an accomplished meditator can have that choice to choose their rebirth. And I think that extends to many Tibetan schools, many Buddhist schools, not only Tibet. But I use Tibet as an example because I'm familiar with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But I think there's more to it than metaphysics, And I do think that. I don't believe that I had a hand in how the world was created. I don't believe that I somehow had a hand in the pushing towards the Big Bang or anything like that. You know,
you would have done something totally different. You would have never created this mess if it would have been up to you.
But we can joke about it, but I do think there's an element of ego involved in that type of philosophy, whether it's unconscious or quite conscious. I do think that there.
Yeah, well,
uh,
that is a philosophy that comes out of New Age circles a lot of times that
hmm.
have been criticized for being too inflated. Exactly what you just said.
Oh, right.
That is
Yeah.
the criticism of those teachings.
Oh,
And it's the same thing with the law of, manifestation and the law of attraction and the secret. They get criticized. They think it's kind of what Carl Jung would have called inflation. You're
hmm.
thinking you're more powerful than you actually are.
Yeah. I mean, so this conversation that you and I are having right now is the result of billions and billions of causes and conditions that came together in just the right way so that you and I are now having this conversation. I mean, it's infinite, going back to the beginning, to the Big Bang, and going back to, however long ago, 400 billion years ago, and the right causes and conditions, just to use one trail of thought there, that allowed single cells to be created on this planet, and then those single cells somehow came together to create multi-celled organisms, which eventually came together to create fish, which eventually came together after hundreds of million years to so fish evolved that had legs and lungs, and then another, the safety in the environment, the need for survival, the drives. It's incomprehensible that because I meditate in a certain way that I would have caused this. To me, to my thinking, I don't understand how that is, how I could drop some energy into this cosmic soup to bring out some sort of manifestation when there are billions and billions, literally billions and billions of causes and conditions which lead to any given moment. That the idea that I could change that in some way is, for me, I don't really understand how that might happen. Now, at the same time, I do think we do make choices. You approached me this morning. Do you want to do a talk? Yeah, I would love to. And so we both made choices. You made the choice to reach out. I made the choice to say yes, and we made the choice together to connect. And here we are. And so I do think there's a healthy combination of both of those sides or both of those beliefs that you mentioned. Now, I also think that a meditation practice or a contemplation practice, if you will, any sort of spiritual growth practice can allow somebody to rest in the idea that we have no control. Because
Sure, I think so. I think that I mean, and I'm with you too on the side of, having no control, and on the side of, yeah, there's all these factors coming into it. It's, predetermined, not that you have to take that completely literally, but generally speaking, yeah, I mean, that's how it is. But I think it's just too terrifying for most people to accept that is kind of the block against accepting it.
mm.
It's like, yikes, no control. Oh my.
Well, it's not how our nervous system sees the world, too. I mean, people wake up, they go to the work that they, applied for, that they might have studied years to get, or they go to school, and there is all of this forward motion that we feel that gives us this free will, that we feel that gives us a volition, a directionality in our life. and I think what people miss in that is that we don't have any control over our, how we're approached by other people. Like if I was to say to you right now, well, don't think of whales, right? Well, of course, immediately what comes into the mind is a whale, and you had no control over my saying that,
Well,
and,
I'm not even sure we have control over our body's functioning right now. It's kind of just happening automatically. Like we didn't really design stuff to function this way.
no, sure, of course. I mean, we don't have control over most of our body, the heart, the mind, for the most part. And the mind, that's why we meditate, is to try to gain some dexterity over how our thoughts are working or silenced like that. But yeah, the heart, the lungs, the blood, we don't circulate our blood. We don't digest our food, not consciously, and things like that. And I think that in a way can be seen as an extension of our surroundings. We don't control the way people approach us. We don't control things that people say to us. We don't control the opportunities that are brought to us, but we do control how we respond to all of that. And I think that's why a meditation practice can be so effective, so beautiful, is that we start to have a little more dexterity on how we do respond, because we can slow the thinking process down. We can observe our thoughts so that we're more mindful. When somebody says, "Oh, don't think of a whale," you automatically say, "Well, I don't really need to think of a whale," Or when somebody, offers you an opportunity to do a talk, you can take a breath and respond according to the present moment, rather than responding out of habit, out of a knee-jerk reaction, or out of fear, or out of aggression, things like that. We start to unplug all of those automatic responses, and we start to plug in to the present moment. And so, in that way, there is this potential to be at least a co-creator of your experience. And so in that way, there is some sort of, at least a little bit of, free will. But I don't think there is this idea that we can meditate and or pray, and that will help bring me a new car, or that will help my brother get through college, or things like that. I don't think it works quite that way.
Yeah, I think that's just probably more of a marketing strategy for a lot of spiritual programs, and it works too,
It
like
does
it's
work. Yeah.
reinforced. But, it occurred to me just then, incidentally, that when you were saying don't think of a whale, and you were talking about having a meditation practice, you could, somehow train, your mind could have enough dexterity to not think of a whale. And it occurred to me that the way to not think of a whale, if you were to say don't think of a whale, would be to think of something else. So immediately you say don't think of a table, and I think of Jesus. Immediately you say don't think of a whale, I think of Jesus. Like
Uh-huh.
you say don't think of something, then I just have a go-to substitute. Like that was kind of interesting that occurd to me. I never really had that thought before, but that is a meditative thing, because I mean, but I'm not necessarily sure. I'm kind of on the same page with you about a lot of this stuff as far as disconnecting from our thoughts, and our thoughts aren't us. Our thoughts aren't that important, because one way to, one technique obviously is things like the mantra, which is the same thing I was saying with the don't think of a whale and I'm thinking of Jesus. It's like, instead of having all your thoughts in your inner dialogue, you basically have a substitute to go to. So you have a mantra, you have a sacred phrase, you have something else, you have a substitute dialogue to just replace over whatever your normal dialogue is. But to me, that just feels like, unless you're somehow, seated back in the formless a little bit. It just, I talked about this on a couple of podcasts ago. I'm talking about this on every podcast because it just feels like a mantra. Using a mantra is like, oh, you were using the metaphor of like a city with a bunch of pollution, and then you go to the mountains and you're like, oh, this is air. So using a mantra would be like being in the city with a bunch of pollution, and then like you have just some machine like with artificial air squirting in there too. It's just like we already have polluted air. Like why put more stuff in there too?
Mm,
It's like it's already a crowded house. Why bring more people into it?
mm,
Why not just step out the back door? I mean, and that's how a lot of times, not all the time, but sometimes mantra practice will hit me that way. It's,
mm.
or at least if I wasn't in a good space, or, maybe in the early days, it would just be like you're just jamming something in there. What do you say to that? What do you say about mantra practice to your students?
Well, I honestly, I've done very little mantra practice. I maybe have done really 2 years of consistent mantra practice, um, and so I can only really speak to it more theoretical than out of firsthand knowledge. But my understanding of mantra is that it's the idea is to replace the the constant flow of thought that's always there in most people's mind, to replace that stream of thought with something of a quote a higher vibrational frequency unquote. And so you use the example of Jesus. Well, great, that's ideally the even the word Jesus, or many Buddhists use the name of Buddha. Namaya no Buddha Amitabha is a mantra that some Buddhist groups use, and so they just chant that over and over again. The idea is to replace the mundane, everyday subliminal chatter with something of a higher vibrational frequency. So that I think is to point one to that formless. So the mantra kind of creates this subliminal chatter that's kind of almost a stepping stone into that formless space underneath the mind. So you replace the subliminal everyday, like, oh, I have to go to the store, I have to buy the eggs, I have to do the homework, I have to do this, I have to do that. That's constantly going, or I should have done this, I should have said that, or I wish I'd done this, or I wish it would be this way. Replacing all of that with the name of the Buddha, or the name of Jesus, or loving kindness, or compassion phrase over and over again. Now, eventually, so that ideally creates this heart of loving kindness, or this heart of God consciousness, or so forth, like that. Then I think the idea of the mantra is, and I never got to this stage with my mantra practice, is that the mantra itself dissolves, and one forgets about the mantra, but they're so identified with the mantra as well. So then the self dissolves into the formless when that person forgets the mantra.
Yeah, it's like your entire body takes the energetic form of the
Right.
mantra. Like if you had Om Namah Shivaya, your entire body would just almost kind of have that structure. And so that structure would be a structure that would, say, be at a frequency where there was almost just a kind of seamless flow to it. So your thoughts would, you'd be balanced out just automatically, I
Mm.
guess.
I suppose that's the idea. Again, I can't speak from experience with that, but from what I understand, to forget the mantra is to forget the self. I think the phrase is, and so both self and mantra dissolve into the formless at the peak of mantra practice. And I think, just like with silent meditation and the meditation practices that I do, it's probably something that comes and goes. I don't think I don't think one can ever really get to a state where it's, your whole life, your whole existence is in that formlessness. But I think it is a kind of a waxing and waning type of experience. Yeah.
So you've done a whole lot of good study, and I'm sure you've just read a whole lot of good books, and maybe even books that aren't, necessarily on the shelves of the bestseller section at Barnes and Noble. And so I was wondering if you just could rattle off some book recommendations for
Sure,
people on all of this stuff.
sure. My favorite author of late is Stephen Batchelor. And I can recommend any of his books. I think A Secular Buddhist is one of my favorites. A beautiful, beautiful book where he was actually a monk for just under 20 years in two different traditions, but now he's given up the monastic life and teaches as a layperson. And A Secular Buddhist, also Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, both really wonderful books. He has a new book out called The Art of Solitude, which I've just finished, and it's a great read. It's a little more entertaining and less kind of life changing in a way. It's more it's lighthearted, lighthearted read, but still a very spiritual read. So for those looking for something like that, a little kind of in between there, a great book. Again, Stephen Batchelor, The Art of Solitude, and actually, what a great title for being in quarantine, right? The Art of Solitude.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. How do you spell his last name?
Bachelor, just like being a single male, Batchelor.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's got several books out, and they're all worth reading, I think. But those three are probably my favorite. Of course, Ken Wilber, another one of my favorites. His book No Boundary is one that I keep coming back to time and time again. I think it's really, for me, it was a life-changing read. Also,
Okay, that's
yeah.
good to know because Wilbur has so many books,
Mm.
different people have different favorites, but No Boundary is the one that stood out to you.
Yeah, No Boundary for me was really, it might have been when I read it, it might have been, had something to do with that where I was in my own practice. But it landed on me and really opened a lot of doors for me and continues to do so. Each time I go back and read, even just read a page or two, it really just opens another door. And I mentioned at the earlier part of this talk, I mentioned the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And if anyone's interested in reading that, Robert Thurman, the great professor at Columbia University, has an amazing translation of that commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So I recommend that. He's made it accessible for people who aren't Buddhist, accessible for people who aren't meditators, but it's actually quite deep and reaches some really great places. So that's also a great read, I think.
So most of your stuff, would you say you're much more well read in Buddhism than Hinduism? Obviously, there's some cross mingling there, but
Oh yeah,
is
yeah.
that fair?
Oh, absolutely. I haven't. I studied Hinduism for about 5 or 6 years when I was living in New York, from 2002 to 2006 or seven. Even in that time, I was still a student at the New York Zen Center, so I was kind of mixing and matching philosophies and practices at that time. But I haven't really read anything from Orthodox Hinduism since probably 2004, 2005. Nothing against Hinduism. I found those practices and the philosophies to be quite rich, very mythological rich in that way. But while I was doing that and studying at the Zen Center, I always found myself translating Hinduism to the language of Buddhism. And so I was like, well, this is kind of, eventually it dawned on me, I'm kind of a slow learner sometimes, but it dawned on me, well, why aren't I just using my energy to study Buddhism more rather than doing this translation work? And so I ended up kind of phasing out my interest in Hinduism. That being said, I honestly don't really consider myself a Buddhist any longer. I haven't for quite some time, and I just enjoy spiritual practices, and I enjoy reading wisdom from wherever it comes, whether it's Rumi or from the Bible or from someone like Stephen Batchelor or Ken Wilber, Eckhart Tolle. I think wisdom is wisdom. Joseph Campbell, I love Joseph Campbell. He's a self-proclaimed atheist and things like that. So wherever, if it lands on my heart, if it brings something to me, a new angle, a new perspective, I'm grateful for it wherever it came from.
Now, is Batchelor an atheist, or was that kind of what he was saying that to make up some point?
I think he goes back and forth. I actually haven't talked to him personally about his religion, but I think from what I gathered from his writings, he goes back and forth from, of course, he was a devout Buddhist when he was a monk, and then I gathered that he went into atheism for a little while, and now he's coined the term secular Buddhism. He's one of the founding fathers, if you will, of that movement, secular Buddhism.
Okay, I didn't even know there was a movement.
Oh yeah. It's slow, but picking up steam. There's several teachers who are self-proclaimed secular Buddhists. I guess if I had to identify with any one particular school, I would probably identify with being a secular Buddhist.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great catching up with you, man. I'm really glad this worked.
I am too. It's really always a pleasure, Clint. Always a pleasure. It's always great to connect with you and great to catch up. I'm glad you're staying well and healthy in this time. It's always good to check in with old friends and to make sure that everyone's doing well and not sick. So yeah.
Yeah, likewise. I'm glad you're doing well too, and you're in a great place, and kind of got a rich, abundant time for yourself and your girlfriend and your kitten,
Yes.
and that's great. So I'll send you a little heads up once I get this up and edited and published. I'll send you a message and let you know.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing it, and I'll share it on all of my sites as well. So
Okay, great. Sounds good, man. Take care.
yeah, same to you. Have a good night.